This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
And welcome back to the X-Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell, coming to you from our studio in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. 1-800-610-7035, worldwide, toll-free. Email xzone at xzoneradiotv.com. On MSN Messenger, xzoneradiotv at hotmail.com. And our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. Exonation, my guest this hour is Dr. Kevin D. Randle. He is a retired lieutenant colonel from the Iowa National Guard, as well as a prominent ufologist within the UFO community. He is often regarded as one of the leading experts on the reported crash of a UFO near Roswell, New Mexico, going way back to 1947. And Kevin Randle, welcome back to the X-Zone. How are you, sir?
I am fine, and I'm delighted to be back.
Always great having you with us, Kevin. One of the questions that we still get asked here at the X-Zone pertaining to Roswell is, why hasn't the mystery been solved after all these years?
I think the government began a very brilliant disinformation campaign and have stuck with it for all these years. They came out in 1947 and said it was a weather balloon, and because military officers and government officials with some sort of credibility were saying this thing, the news media said, yeah, they couldn't get any additional information. When the event took place, well, let's talk to Jesse Marcel, so they would call to Roswell, but Marcel wasn't there. He'd been sent to Fort Worth. They couldn't get a hold of the rancher because he lived on a ranch without a phone. The sheriff wouldn't talk to anybody. In fact, there's quotes in the newspaper where the sheriff was saying, well, you'll have to talk to the boys out to the base. So they orchestrated it brilliantly back in 1947, and it just sort of died, especially when they said, well, it's a weather balloon, and here it is. And everybody came in and said, yeah, it's a weather balloon, and that was the end of the story. It wasn't until Jesse Marcel in 1978 said, I picked up pieces of flying saucer back in 1947, that the rest of us started to get interested in it. But there was also another problem, and that was the Aztec, New Mexico crash, alleged crash from 1948, and that came out in a book called Behind the Flying Saucers. The government had nothing to do with that. Frank Scully, who was a reporter for Daily Variety, or I think it was Weekly Variety at the time, wrote the book, and it became a bestseller. True Magazine paid a reporter an enormous amount of money to investigate it. They didn't care what the determination was at the end. They just wanted a good story and wanted to know what was going on. And this fellow, J.P. Kane, did such a brilliant job of crashing the idea of this crash at Aztec, and I think he was absolutely correct. There had not been any crash there, although there's supposedly a new book coming out that will prove me wrong on that. But did such a brilliant job of crashing that nobody wanted to talk about UFO crashes. It was just that sort of a thing.
Kevin, stand by. You and I have to take our first 2-minute commercial break. Dr. Kevin Randle is our special guest, Exonation. His blog spot is now, pay attention to this, www.kevinrandle, and that's RANDLE.blogspot.com. That's Kevin, RANDLE.blogspot.com. We'll be back on the other side of this 2-minute commercial break. Don't go away.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan, and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Kevin Randle's our special guest this hour, Exonation. And Kevin, what about the possibility that the alleged crash at Roswell, New Mexico, was actually a weather balloon, part of the Mogul project?
To buy into that explanation, you have to accept the idea that Mogul was so highly classified that nobody knew what it was, which is what the skeptics have been putting out for years. But it turns out Mogul itself was not classified. The purpose to put a balloon, to create a constant level balloon, a balloon that would fly at a certain altitude for a long period of time, was what it was all about. That project was burned in the newspaper 2 days after the announcement that they'd captured a flying saucer. In other words, there was pictures of the Mogul operation at Alamogordo. It was so unclassified that the name Mogul actually appeared in Dr. Albert Crary, and he was the head of the project, his diary. He says at one point, the Mogul equipment has arrived. The purpose was highly classified, but the launches weren't. Everybody knew what was going on, and in fact, the guys with Mogul had been over to Roswell in the days preceding their first launches to get their help in tracing the balloons, tracking the balloons, and recovering the balloons. So everybody knew what was going on. They wouldn't have been fooled by it because they were weather balloons, and they knew what weather balloons looked like. So the Mogul explanation does not cover the facts. Doesn't mean what fell was extraterrestrial. It just means Mogul is not an acceptable or a very good explanation.
There's one thing that's always bothered me about the entire Roswell story, one thing more than anything else, and maybe as a member of the military you could help explain this to me. Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, went out to the scene, collected some of the debris, and instead of taking it right back to the base, he decided to go home and show his wife and child. Now, didn't he break the actual chain of custody at that point?
Well, he didn't break the chain of custody, and the stuff wasn't classified at the time when he went home. It would become highly classified right after that when they discovered what they had. But Jesse Marcel wanted at least his son to know what this stuff was, know what was going on, wanted to see this incredibly important thing that he had found.
But let me ask you. I'm sorry for interrupting here, but had Jesse Marcel any experience or expertise that he could actually make an intelligent decision and say to his son that this is a UFO? How did he come to that conclusion?
Based on what the debris looked like. He knew what we had in our inventory, meaning what aircraft. He knew what weather balloons looked like. He had been an intelligence officer in the Pacific during the Second World War, so he was familiar with all of that stuff.
Right.
And his job in 1947 was to become familiar with what the Soviets had, what sort of missiles they had, what sort of armaments they had, so that if war came, he would be in a position to brief the air crews on what they could expect during the mission. So he would be familiar with all of that sort of thing. So when he looked at this stuff, he knew that it was nothing that belonged to us, and he knew it was nothing that belonged to the Soviets. And he knew based on what he was handling that it was nothing like anything he'd ever seen on Earth. So he could make that conclusion. He could draw that conclusion. Now, in 1947, the idea was that this stuff was interplanetary as opposed to interstellar, meaning the people dealing with it thought they were dealing with something from Mars or possibly Venus, because they didn't know Venus was, the surface temperature was like 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Right. They didn't know that, but so they thought that Venus and Mars could possibly hold life, and believe that this is where the source of the flying saucers, that they were interplanetary. We now know it's probably interstellar. But certainly he could draw that conclusion. But he also, I mean, you're talking about metal that if you, foil-like metal, if you wadded it up into a ball and let it go, it would fold itself.
But once again, Kevin, we're surmising it did because you didn't see it. I have never seen it. The people who are writing about it, talking about it, have never seen it. So how do we know that this is really true?
based on the eyewitness testimony, the people that handled the material.
All right. If in fact this was a real event, why did it take 31 years for the silence to be broken?
Well, once again, we get back to Frank Scully in his book, Behind the Flying Saucers, and the expose done by J.P. Kane of the San Francisco Chronicle that proved that this book was basically bogus, and it so destroyed the idea. Kane did such a wonderful job of exposing this hoax that no one in the UFO community wanted to talk about UFO crashes from that point on. And it wasn't until Len Strainfield, a researcher who had a great command of the UFO field and was highly respected by everyone, said, maybe we ought to take another look at some of these UFO crash stories because there's some interesting stuff going on. And from that point, we all began to look at these things a little more closely than we had in the past. So when people were looking at UFOs, they liked them in the sky. They liked the sights in the sky. They liked landing traces. Many people weren't real thrilled about the idea of occupants. I know NICAP and Kehoe at one point really kind of stayed away from the idea that they would land and people or creatures would get out. APRO, on the other hand, Coral and Jim Lorenzen, they kind of embraced the occupant stories. But you had all that stuff going on as well, not to mention the contactees are saying, I've flown with the people from Venus and I've been up to their planet, and it made the whole field look like a bunch of crackpots. So nobody's really looking at those sort of stories. They were trying to look at it from a scientific point of view and bring some of the people trying to bring a bit of science into the investigation of UFOs. So it took that long until Jesse Marcel said, I picked up pieces, and we had a name, we had a location, and then we could get further on it. Walter Hott, the base information officer back in 1947, had put together a yearbook. What a wonderful resource for us, because now we could see the names of 80% of the people who were assigned to the base in 1947. We'd say, here are the people we need to contact and see what they had to say, and see if we could learn more about it. When I began my investigation, and by mine I mean Don Schmitz and my investigation into the Roswell case, I went in fully expecting to spend 3 or 4 days in Roswell coming up with the balloon answer and say, well, that's it, we can go home now. And it seemed that it was going that way in the first couple of days, because we ended up with a group of weirdos who were meet on a regular basis in Albuquerque and communicated with the Space Brethren. I thought, well, that's no help. And we met with Cliff Stone, who knew a lot about UFOs, but didn't have any personal experience with the Roswell case until we met with Bill Brazel. And here's the son of the man who'd found the debris on his ranch, Mac Brazel, and could tell us about what he'd seen and what he'd held and what he'd experienced. And a very, very down-to-earth man who wasn't looking for publicity, wasn't looking for a notoriety, didn't care to be on TV, but was telling what he remembered about this event back in 1947. And at that point I said, there's something more here. We need to dig a little bit deeper. And then we found members of Colonel Blanchard's staff, Blanchard being the commanding officer in Roswell in 1947. Every member of his staff we talked to, with one exception, said that this thing was extraterrestrial, that it was an alien spacecraft. It was something that was that came to Earth. Jesse Marcel's words, it was something that came to Earth, but it was not made on Earth. And so by looking at all of that stuff, we came to the conclusion that it was extraterrestrial in origin. But it took fighting through all that baggage, you might say, from the UFO field that had built up for 30 years or 35 years, and coming into it and trying to look at it with a new critical eye to see where this would take us.
Where has it taken you?
I believe, based on a number of interviews I conducted, that we're talking extraterrestrial, that this was something from outer space. And I look at, the one thing I cannot prove because of the circumstances involved, but I called Edwin Easley. And Don and I were spending an awful lot of money on this investigation, and my phone bills were running back in the 90s, early 90s, before we could call everybody in the world for free practically, $200-300 a month. And that's not generating any income. But I was at the Center for UFO Studies, and they were going to have their normal meeting. I said, if you need to make some phone calls, go ahead and use our phone. I'm thinking, geez, a phone I don't have to pay for. I'm on board. And I called Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, the top cop on the base. He was in charge of both the MP squadron and the Special Services squadron, which the MPs patrolled the town, the other squadron patrolled the base, security on the base. And in my discussions with him at this one time at the center, I said, are we following the right path? And Easley said, what do you mean? And I said, we think it was extraterrestrial. And he said, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path. In essence, telling me it's extraterrestrial. Well, I didn't record it because I was at the center office. I didn't have my recording equipment. Everybody says, well, I'd have gone out and bought a cheap recorder and called him right back and got him to say it again. I fully expected to meet with the guy. I fully expected to go to Fort Worth where he lived and sit down with a videotape camera and chat with him about this. Mark Rodiger, the scientific director, wanted me to set up a meeting. He was going to be in Fort Worth. Could I set up a meeting with Easley? I said, sure, I'll be glad to do that. And I wrote down there and discovered that Easley was now terminal with cancer. And his wife was afraid, really afraid. And I have the letter, a beautifully written letter from one of the daughters. And I look at this letter, the sentence structure, the terminology. I mean, beautifully written letter that shows that back in the 40s and 50s we actually got an education, not like today. But explaining that her mother was convinced I was a government agent and that her husband was in trouble for telling me.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Kevin Randle's our special guest this hour, Exonation, www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and Randle is spelled R-A-N-D-L-E, so that's kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Kevin, how do you, as a UFO researcher, differentiate between a real UFO sighting and a hoax?
A lot of times it comes down to the reputation of the witness.
Mm-hmm.
Is the witness who he says he is? And that's the thing that stuns me about how many people make up backgrounds to make themselves sound credible. Back in 1990, I think it was, the United States asked on the census, one of the questions was, are you a Vietnam veteran?
Mm-hmm.
13 million people of the 2.5 million who really were said they were. 13 million people said they were. I mean, 11 million of them were lying about it.
Why would
you?
Yeah.
Why would you do that on the census? Nobody cares. But people do that all the time. So you look at the background of the person. You look at the story. Does the story make sense? Is there a hole in the story? I know when I was putting together Crash, when UFOs fall from the sky, I was doing the Del Rio crash again, looking at that stuff, and I thought, I'll see if there's anything new on the internet. What a wonderful tool. So I typed in Del Rio UFO crash and Robert Willingham and came up and discovered a whole bunch of new information, or different information, that the date had changed, the type of aircraft he was flying changed, the location changed, all these changes. That smacks of a hoax. And I finally asked Noah Torres and Ruben Ugarte, who'd done the lion's share of the research in the latest version, and they're very, very good guys, very, very credible researchers, very careful researchers, if they had bothered to check Willingham's background. And they said no, they thought Bruce Maccabee had done that. So I wrote to Bruce Maccabee and said, did you do did you look into the background of this guy? And he said, no, Todd Zeckel's done that. Well, Todd Zeckel was a researcher of mediocre skills, so I did, and could find nothing to suggest that Robert D. Willingham had ever been an Air Force pilot. All the sources you'd expect his name to surface, he wasn't there. The Record Center in St. Louis sent me the military record, or what they could send that didn't violate the Privacy Act, but sent me his military record, and it turned out he'd been a very low-ranking enlisted man, joined the Army, according to them, in 1945, which technically makes him a veteran of World War II because the war wasn't officially declared over until 1946, even though the Japanese and the Germans had surrendered in 1945. So he joined the Army after the hostilities had ended, but technically was a veteran of World War II and stayed in until January of 1947. Managed to rise to the rank of E4, fairly low-ranking enlisted grade. But he said that his records had burned up in St. Louis during the Great Fire, which is what everybody's excuse is. But there are other sources of records that can be reconstructed. And I went to those sources, and I could find nothing to suggest he'd have been an Air Force pilot. If he had not been an Air Force pilot, his whole story collapsed. So there was no reason to accept that. So I believe that the Del Rio crash is a hoax, given what I could find, and he's the sole witness to that story. So that one I kind of write off. And in the book, I'm a little bit less, or a little kinder about that, only because I hadn't really completed everything that I wanted to do. I was fairly certain it was a hoax, but I also felt a little bit sorry for Torres and Uriarte because they had self-published this book about Willingham's story. And they had been caught by this guy thinking that he was a credible source, and he was not.
With all the digital cameras, webcams, law enforcement, security, corporate, industrial, satellite digital photography, how come there hasn't been that all-conclusive photo of a UFO yet?
That's the one question I've had for a long time. And looking at that, I always thought about all these people running around with their 35 millimeter cameras before everything was so ubiquitous. Why we didn't have a case where we had the UFO photograph from 2 or 3 locations and we could triangulate and get a good idea of the size and the speed. And I was thinking of a meteor that had entered the atmosphere over the Grand Teton Mountains in, I think it was the 1960s. We had videotape, or film actually, of it, and photographs from several different locations. But what was the difference? Well, this was something that was very bright and very big at 40 and 50 miles high, so it could be seen over a large area. And UFOs historically are much closer to the ground. And so you'd expect not to have those opportunities. But with everything out there today, I would expect us to get something like that. But I think the other problem is the visitation isn't nearly as pervasive as everybody believes. We don't see, the real UFOs don't exist as often as people say. People are fooled. My PhD dissertation was on how belief structure influences the identification of an ambiguous stimuli, which means simply you see a light in the sky, how does your brain process the information? And discovered, of course, that if you believed in ghosts and that sort of thing, you were more likely to interpret this ambiguous stimuli as a ghost as something else. If you believed in alien spacecraft, you might interpret it that way. And so I think we get a lot of that sort of thing. But there should be a good photographic case. The one thing that comes closest, or one of the cases that comes closest, is from Levelland, Texas in 1957. And here we had witnesses at 13 different locations scattered around the Lubbock area of Texas, reporting an object close to the ground, reporting it stalling their car engines, causing their radios to fade or fill with static, causing their headlights to dim until it takes off. And we find another side of the coin. The Air Force said in their response was, well, there weren't that many witnesses, there were only 3, and called Don Kehoe, who had said there were as many as 9 different witnesses, a liar because the Air Force didn't find that many. Well, going back and looking at this case, like 40 years later, I could find witnesses at 13 separate locations. So both people were wrong. But you had the UFO interacting with the environment. You had the eyewitness testimony. You had possibility of a landing trace where the object was seen and left a burned area on the ground, which was never very well explored back in 1957. So you had 3 different chains of evidence that could take you to the point of this being something extremely unusual. But by 1957, the Air Force was more interested in explaining UFOs than they were in investigating them. The UFO organizations, civilians, NICAP and APRO, were so busy fighting one another for the membership dollar that they were at odds at what was going on. So all these sorts of things get lost in the big fights. And I think a lot of that is happening today. Not to mention you've got the skeptics who are outraged if we suggest there's a UFO. They are the keepers of the flame. They are the keepers of all knowledge, and they know that there are no UFOs, and anybody who suggests they've seen one or photographed one must be either a liar or a hoaxer or mistaken, because there simply are not things like that. So we get all these different organizations, all these different factions fighting with one another. Then the truth gets lost in the middle.
Let me ask you this, Kevin.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me ask you this, my friend. Do you believe that the U.S. government and other governments of the world are communicating with these extraterrestrials, and that certain treaties have been made?
No, I do not.
Do you believe
I know there's a lot of that information out there.
Yeah.
But if I look at it from the point of view of the aliens, what would be the point?
Mm-hmm.
They can do whatever they want.
Where does MJ-12 fit into the entire picture?
This I believe to be a hoax. And back in the mid-1980s when it surfaced, there was a fellow named Bill Moore who wrote the Roswell incident, as a matter of fact, that kind of launched us all into this thing. And he was saying to friends, and a number of people have said this, and you can find the verification on the internet if you look for it, that he was thinking of creating a Roswell-like document to try to convince other people to come forward and tell their stories, because he didn't know what else to do. Never thought to look in the yearbook and call people, or try to find the sheriff's family or something like that. But he was going to create a Roswell-like document, and lo and behold, pretty soon he's got one that came to him from a source with no provenance. We don't know where it came from, other than Albuquerque, New Mexico. No other document has ever been found in all the government archives that have been searched by lots of researchers, including me, that reference MJ-12. And so this seems to be one of the problems that we have with UFO. We get diverted into these subsets like MJ-12. The Willingham story becomes important because the Willingham story is actually mentioned in the Eisenhower briefing document, which is part of the MJ-12 documents. And there's a short paragraph in there about that. And if the Willingham sighting is a hoax, what does that tell you about the rest of the document?
The whole thing is a hoax.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But in the UFO field, we get caught up in these subsets. We start looking into these things in depth. And now that I say, well, the MJ-12 is hoax, I'm the bad guy in the UFO field because people want to believe that this thing is true. And I'm sure that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll hear a lot from Stan Friedman explaining why I'm absolutely wrong on MJ-12. But the point is, I think the document is a hoax, and we get caught up in this. We get caught up in the cattle mutilations. We get caught up in the abduction phenomenon. We get caught up in the crop circles. And so the resources that we could bring to bear on solving parts of the problem are so scattered that we can't make any real progress. And if we find a solution for something, there's a large number of people who will just not accept that no matter what kind of evidence you bring forward and decide, well, you're just a government agent. And I don't know how many times I've been labeled a government agent,
well,
especially being with a military background.
Exactly. A few months ago, there was a press conference in Washington where former members of the United States Air Force went on camera and disclosed that they had witnessed UFOs over very delicate missile sites throughout the United States. What's your take on that?
Robert Hastings, who organized and orchestrated this and did a book about it, very careful researcher, not prone to running off on tangents. I think he's presented some very, very important information that, of course, gets lost again in the arguments because we have the skeptics who don't want to believe it. So obviously these guys are all mistaken. There's one guy out there who said his father was the commander of one of the missile sites and said that this never happened. Well, the son's saying this. We don't know what the father said. The father is deceased. So we don't know for sure what the father said. So there's all kinds of these people arguing with Hastings about this. But I think Hastings has presented some very important information that we ought to take a look at. And even if it's not extraterrestrial, something was mucking about with the missiles and disabling them, and we should learn what that is so that we can counter that just in case we ever need the darn things.
Is there a government conspiracy? Is there a government cover-up?
Well, I think there's a cover-up, but conspiracy. I've often joked about this, saying that we end up with people, well, like Willingham and others claiming all these things. And I'm thinking if I was running the cover-up committee or this information committee, I'd take credit for all this stuff. I'd go to my boss and say, see, look what I've done. I got this guy out here saying this, and it's not true, and everybody's going to know it. It's going to just undermine the whole thing. I'd take credit for it. They don't have to do anything because we in the UFO field do it to ourselves all the time. I don't happen to believe what Stan Friedman says about MJ-12. I become the bad guy, but it undermines everything. We don't have a rational discussion about whether or not MJ-12 is legitimate. Instead, I'm attacked personally. Well, you can't believe what Randle says. He writes science fiction, which is absolutely true. In fact, I got a horror novel that just came out, a vampire horror novel that just came out called Cleverly Vampire. So I'm the only person in the UFO field whose day job disqualifies him from UFO research because they say, well, you can't believe what he says. He writes science fiction.
But what does that tell you? But what does that tell you about the mentality of people who claim to be UFO researchers? Then
I was going to say, but they never say that about Nick Pope. They never say that about Bruce Maccabee. They never say that about Whitley Strieber.
Yeah,
it's only me because I happen to take, in some cases, a very skeptical point of view.
Or is it skeptical or is it realistic? Objective.
I would say realistic from my point of view, but the point is, you too often you cannot have a rational discussion about this because people are so wrapped up in their belief structure that they will not accept an explanation for anything. And I'm just absolutely stunned with some of the people that I meet in the field embracing everything, whether it's automatic channeling from the space brethren to the animal mutilations being done by aliens for God knows what reason.
Well, that's because the prices at McDonald's are too expensive for the little guys. That's all.
Yeah, but they're only taking certain things, and it's not the parts I'd want to eat.
Oh, well, there we go. We've got to take our break. Please stand by, Kevin. Kevin Randle is our guest, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. We'll be back on the other side of this break.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Explanation, Kevin Randle is my guest to this hour. It's always great having Kevin on the show. His website is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And Randle is spelled R-A-N-D-L-E, so that's kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Kevin, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's always a great pleasure having you on the show. What would you like to tell the members of the X-Zone Nation about ufology in general?
Probably nothing very good. It is just so fractured that we can't get anything done. We argue with each other. We tear each other down. We spend a great deal of time explaining why the other guy's theories not even a theory, why the other guy is a bad guy, not explaining why he is wrong or what the evidence, where the evidence would take us. We just don't use the scientific method. We make fun of science, but the scientific method is a neutral-based way of investigating things that we should embrace, and we just don't do it. And when the facts run against us, we reject the facts, regardless of how many times we've driven the stake through the heart of the vampire. It always seems to rise again, and I don't care what case it is and how badly mangled the case is, and Aztec is the perfect example. It was thoroughly destroyed in 1952. It came back in the mid-1970s and was destroyed again, and came back in the mid-1980s and was destroyed again, and now it's going to come out again with a new book which supposedly has all this new information, but I have no clue as to what that information might be. And from what I know, there's nothing that extraordinary in it. But here we are. We're going to have another round of the Aztec UFO crash coming up here pretty quick.
Kevin, you've got a number of books that are available for sale to the public. How can they find out where your books are and where can they buy them?
The crash, when UFOs fall from the sky, of course, are in the bookstores. Mm-hmm. You can go to Amazon.com and buy it cheaper. You can get it for your Kindle if you wish at Amazon.com, and if you do that, I'd appreciate it if you'd pick up the science fiction novel on the second Tuesday of next week, so I could run the numbers up a little higher on Kindle. But my books are available in the bookstores. They're available through Amazon.com. They're available at BarnesandNoble.com and everywhere you'd look for books.
One quick question for you: do you think Roswell will ever be solved one way or another?
I think eventually we're going to know the truth, and I think the reason we'll know the truth is because something outside the ability of the government to hide is going to happen, and it's all going to tumble down. The alien creatures, if they decide to announce their presence to the world, can't be stopped by the government. The cover-up works now simply because the aliens haven't made their presence known. But once they do that, the secret's out. And I think at that point we'll learn more about it.
Quickly, why haven't they made themselves known? They being the aliens.
It could be the prime directive, which is observe but don't interfere. Mm-hmm. And we do know about them. We do know they're here, but they have not made any attempts to guide human existence or human society. I think maybe something as simple as the prime directive, observe but don't interfere.
Kevin, we've run out of time for tonight. We'll have you back on in the very near future. Until then, my friend, thanks very much for joining us. A great pleasure talking to you. To you and yours, a very happy new year.
Well, thank you very much, and same to you.
Take care, Kevin. Exo Nation. For more information on Kevin Randle, www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. That's KEVINRANDLE.blogspot.com. I'll be back after the news at 6.5 minutes past as we continue here in the X Zone. Don't go away.